Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's wonderful to have you on this webinar this afternoon, and absolutely fantastic to see so many people joining us. We've got 100 and, oh, it's going up even as I speak, 158, 159 people joining us. So clearly very popular and interesting topic ahead of us. Um, I would just like to take a moment, firstly, and as a reflection of the institution's recognition of the deep history and culture of the island, the University of Tasmania wishes to acknowledge the traditional owners, the Palawa people and custodians of the land upon which we meet, and pay respects to elders past, present, and emerging. My name is Kate Robertson, and I'm the Executive Director of Advancement. And part of my portfolio includes looking after our alumni relations program. And as such, it's wonderful to be part of this webinar series this afternoon. The Explore series has been very much designed with our alumni in mind, and in particular that we provide opportunities for enrichment and for advancement, and we hope some inspiration. I'm sure this afternoon you're also going to learn a great deal too. And it's one of those advantages of being part of the alumni community that we can gather together as a group against common interests, and also have the opportunity to connect with each other, and great deal of expertise and insights from within our alumni community, and indeed from our staff at the university. You are very much part of our essential, very fabric part of the university, and it's why we're just interested in connecting with you in different ways. We've learned through COVID that the opportunity to meet together online is actually a very enriching and helpful way in which we can get together in ways that even without COVID, I'm very much doubt that we would have 169, 170 people joining us together on a Tuesday afternoon. So it's great that we're able to do that. And we hope that these talks really are a point of interest for you, and find different ways in which we can meet your particular interests. So just a few quick housekeeping notes before we move on. Just to let you know that your microphone, camera and chat function and the raised hand function have all been disabled within the Zoom functionality. And that's just so we can make sure that our speaker doesn't get interrupted while she's presenting. We do encourage you to ask questions, and you can do that by typing into the Q&A function on Zoom. And we do also have some advanced questions. In fact, we have so many advanced questions that probably we could fill the time just with those, but we'll do our best to get through everything. We can't always answer everything, and we tend not to answer the ones which are of very specific and highly personal nature. I'm sorry that will disappoint some people, but we'll do our best to find those questions which might have some interest for the most people on the call. And finally, just to let you know that this conversation is being recorded, and that allows you to have access to it via our YouTube channel after the webinar, or indeed for other people to be able to access who haven't been able to join us today. So today we are lucky enough to be joined by an alumna, researcher, lecturer, and family history enthusiast. We'll be hearing insights and tips for finding and interpreting information about your ancestors, and sharing family stories with others. So it gives me very great pleasure to introduce you to our speaker today, Dr. Imogen Wegman. Having grown up in Hobart, Imogen has a strong connection to her island home. She completed her undergraduate studies at the University of Tasmania in 2012 before moving to the UK, my place of birth, to join the University of East Anglia, and in particular the Landscape History Master's Programme there, focusing on medieval common edge drift. That is the phenomenon of villages moving away from their parish church building. Imogen returned to Tasmania to complete her PhD in history at the University of Tasmania, examining the differences between land grants given to convicts and free settlers. Her research continues to examine the practicalities of the life in the early years of a colony, using digital tools such as now this is going to show my ignorance, Imogen, GIS mapping, to understand the history landscape and extract its stories. She's currently a lecturer in humanities at the University of Tasmania, concentrating within the university's Diploma of Family History and the Bachelor of Arts. And I know many of you on this call will be familiar with Imogen already. But without further ado, let me hand over to Imogen.
Hello. Oh, hang on. I've lost the button to turn my camera back on. There it is. Okay. Hello. Thank you for having me along today. Thank you, Alumni Office, for inviting me to come and have a chat. I am a Tasmanian born and bred, but as you'll see as we progress through this talk today, I am the child of a lot of migration and sometimes no migration at all. And so we'll explore a little bit of my history, because I know whenever I'm talking to family historians or potential family historians, that's always one of the questions that people want to know about. Where do I come from? What's my background? I have a slightly unusual name, which piques a lot of interest. But we'll come to that in a moment. So a popular present at the moment is often a genealogical DNA test. And it seems like everyone has at least one family member who's done one these days, or at least everyone with British heritage. So here you can see mine. Some parts of it are actually not too shabby. It's got my mostly Scottish maternal side right down to the parish, which I did find quite impressive. But it is also reliant on who else is doing their DNA test. So to oversimplify how these work, DNA tests work by comparing your DNA to the other sets within their database, and they look for common locations. It's a massive oversimplification, and there is a lot more that happens behind the scenes, but at the core of it is the fact that the only people who are available for comparison are the people who have submitted their tests. So the databases of these companies are massive, and there are lots of experts who know how to get the most out of the results that come from the test. But if you have a nation that isn't terribly interested in genealogy, or who a nation or a group of people who don't have access to the means for testing, that is going to give you a gap in those results. Now, all the companies periodically update their data sets, so your results will change over time. And this happened to me recently when it seemed like the Germanic contingent in my ancestry had finally joined the party. And my results finally started to reflect my aspects of my Dutch heritage. But it must be said, without very much conviction. Switzerland and Germany were labelled as the most likely culprits for those parts of my DNA. This was disappointing, but it wasn't surprising. We have a gap in the family story on that side, and I'd half hoped that some new relations would magically appear. But it wasn't surprising, because the Wegman line was notorious, to me at least, for spending generation after generation tied to one small town in Northern Holland. The pool has always seemed small, so it seemed like a pretty long shot to find enough people who had enough interest in genealogy to appear in the same DNA database as I happened to get a freebie test for. But there are plenty of other ways to find the stories that are missing from my tree. And so today I want to give a brief overview of how to get started on your family history and think about some of the ways we can bring life to these past lives. So what do we mean when we talk about family history? We don't mean just the family tree. That is a part of it, creating the framework that grounds a family narrative. But the emphasis that we have often as academic family historians is on finding about the social history that influenced an individual's or a family's choices. For example, what made people move away from family networks or even emigrate to the other side of the world? Why did people commit the crimes that got them transported? What impact did race or religion have on people's lives 100, 200, 300 years ago? Questions like these help us to fill in the gaps in the records. All historians, including family historians, struggle with missing information, unreliable narrators, muddled memories, and legends. Now, by thinking carefully through the details, we learn to make evidence-based guesses and fill in the gaps to create a more complete story. And this is how we turn a family tree of names and dates into a personality-filled family backstory. So these questions are the how and the why questions, and we have to find a good starting point to get to them. Now, everyone has a different reason for getting into family history research. Some want to resolve a family mystery, while others see it as a great way to keep their minds active. Today, we have huge quantities of records available for free or a monthly subscription. And in the past year, we've seen a lot of students enroll in the diploma because it gives them a hobby that can be done from home during lockdowns. There is a lot of opportunity to travel and explore within family history, but until that's possible again, most people find plenty to get on with by searching online, visiting their local libraries, or getting involved with family history societies, either in person or online. So this is the starting point, thinking about what you want to get out of the activity. You might have a big question, like one of these, but the most efficient searching will actually come by trying to answer one small question at a time. Family history is all about details, and by rushing at too many people and places and events at a time, it becomes chaotic and difficult to follow the threads or even establish the truth of the details. So the best place to start is with the simple questions, the who, what, and when questions. And that's what we have here, asking when or where was someone born? Did someone marry 2 or 3 times? What was someone's name? And who was this mysterious person? Was he connected to the family? So those are examples of questions that people sometimes start with, but there's a whole range. And the best place to start with those is to ask what you already know. So we like to think that when you start a family tree from scratch, or when you're verifying one that you've inherited, it's best to start with the most recent details and move backwards from there. So phone up your older relatives and ask them for details about their births, deaths, and marriages, those of their siblings, all the ones that they know about within the family. Learn how to record a conversation. And after asking for permission, that's really crucial. Make sure you always ask for permission. Record those conversations that you have so that you've got them for later reference. Now, there are far more formal ways to conduct an actual oral history interview, and we cover some of those in our oral history unit, but a simple recording of a chat is a really great start. So, for example, over the last couple of years, I've been sitting down with my parents, the family photo albums, and a decent voice recorder. And we spend a Sunday afternoon drinking tea and chatting our way through the album. They don't always know who the people are in the older albums, but I now have a record of us in conversation with all the rude comments that we make about our beloved ancestors. And while doing that, I also quizzed them about their memories. How did Dad propose to Mum? What does Mum remember about her childhood? So this might seem morbid, but everyone always seems to wish they'd asked someone who is now deceased more questions. I certainly wish I'd asked my granny to answer some specifics about moments in her life. And so I'm trying to head off those regrets by actually asking the questions while I have the chance. Now, I know that I said that names and dates are only a part of doing family history, but they are a really important starting point. So as you gather details from a range of different sources, make sure you're also developing your organization system. I promise you will not ever regret being very organized right from the beginning. In 10 or 20 years, when you pull out a copy of some record, you will not grumble if you immediately located it in the file and can tell exactly where it came from originally. So this sheet is what's known as a pedigree chart. It's a bit of an icky name, but that's what they're called within the family history world. And it's an excellent place to start recording all the names and dates as you collect them. Now, we will send out a PDF of this with the recording of the talk if you do want a copy, but there are also lots of variations available online for you to download and print. It is a standard part of the family history toolkit. So this is how it works. Now, you start to fill it in, and you'll see that I've started to fill this one in with some of my great-grandparents. And so there's a few features on here that are worth noting. We've got each person has a number on the sheet. And so because you'll have multiple sheets for this, you will need to make sure that they can connect together. So we've got number 1 on this chart, on this sheet, is the same as number 10 on sheet number 1. So obviously this is sheet number 2, you can see that under the purple circle there, that this one is sheet number 2. So the first person on here will also be repeated on the previous sheet. And then it's continued onwards, so you can keep track of which direction they're going. Now, as you fill these in, you just fill them in as you find out the details. You will always have to leave some gaps. So here we're not quite sure when Jan died or where. And I had a middle name for Antje, but I wasn't sure if it was actually spelled right, so I left it out for the moment. And you can always go back to fill in those details. So here I worked out that, I have no idea how to say this because I don't actually speak Dutch, but Peter's DR means the daughter of Peter. So whether that was an official name or something that was actually said out loud, or whether that was a name that was to signify that she was Peter's daughter, I'm not sure, but I put it in there because I found it in a few others in the records and I worked out what it meant. Now, it is a really good idea to fill these out in pencil because you'll make mistakes. So this guy had 2 marriages, and it was the second marriage that was meant to go into this chart, not the first one. These charts are focused solely on the generations that were directly related. They don't have space for second marriages or siblings, so you'll need to find another system to keep track of that. But there are plenty of options and plenty of ways of doing that out there. So if you don't mind them using your family data for their own purposes, some of the free online options like Family Search can be useful. So that's where I've got this information from. Now, those ones can be a really helpful way to keep track of lots of names and generations and siblings and extended family. And you can connect your own tree into trees made by other people. But I would remind you that only you know what rigor has gone into your research. The family trees on genealogical websites can vary enormously in quality, depending on the researcher's commitment to checking facts and details. And some of them have automated details included as well from the company thinking that they've identified someone in their record set. So one of the women who is on this page here is listed as starting to have children age 11 to her first husband. And I'm not entirely sure that I trust that. That's someone else's research. So that would be something that you would want to go and track down and see if you can work out what's happening there. There are also computer programs that stand alone from the internet. There's different subscription services if you want to keep digital records, or you might like to keep yourself organized with color-coded ring binders and printouts if you prefer to go with physical copies. Now, those of you with really eagle eyes will have noticed that almost everyone in this little branch was born, married and died in the very same place. So this is Ellesmere. Now, Wegmans were definitely here when it looked like this in the 18th century. So this is approximately the period that that chart covers. And today it's a commuter town on the edge of Schiphol Airport, where the locals bemoan encroaching concrete and all the loss of old traditions. Now, here is the main stretch with the little church shown in a little red pointy bit that is still standing there today. It was built in 1549 when this was quite a small town of 80 families. So the tree on family search suggests that my distant ancestors were there then, but I haven't verified that for myself, so I don't trust it entirely, although my instinct says that it is probably quite right. But nevertheless, whether or not I completely trust all the details in someone else's tree that they've put together, there is some strength in numbers. There are so many people who seem to live their entire lives in Ellesmere. It seems very unlikely that they are all wrong. So you've talked to your memory keepers and you've started to fill out the pedigree chart. You've got some big goals. You've identified some smaller questions that will help you get there. What next? Start with the relevant local library or archive. Most places have research guides for common topics with details about the records that they hold and what kind of information they contain. So here on the screen, you can see the example of Libraries Tasmania, which has their guides online, or they might have printouts in the actual library. Or the librarians might be willing to help you over the phone, or they might have an online chat help thing. So that's always the best place to start. Now, you will want to continue collecting the basic details. So your birth, death, marriage records, or BDM, will be your first stop. You don't have to have a complete pedigree chart before you can start moving outwards from the basics, though. You might fill in what you can, so not everything, just what you can find for 3 or 4 generations, and then start to focus on one individual or family group and put everybody else to the side for the moment. Every Australian state and territory organises their files differently. So they might have indexes with useful information, or you might need to go to a centralised registry and request a copy of the original file for a small fee. Again, ask at your local library and they'll tell you how it works in their area. Now, most of us will have ancestors who migrated to Australia from somewhere else, whether recently or on the First Fleet. There are very useful compilations of resources like the Family Search Research Wiki, which will point you to the resources that are relevant to your people. So this has a huge number of articles and lists of all the different aspects of family history research. Some of it is a little bit outdated. It doesn't always cover everything, but it's a really good starting point. Especially if you're working in an area that you don't know other people working in that country, or you're tackling some complicated data. Now, like BDMs, cemetery and burial records, christening records, or even the family Bible with births recorded can be used to fill out the details. A key skill of the historian is to find alternative sources for the missing details. You may not be able to find a birth record, but check the marriage certificate or the gravestone for a birth date. Excuse me. A birth date or even just a year. This helps you narrow it down so you can refine your search for records that might verify other details. Now, often you'll find discrepancies between dates or names of places. There was a lot of illiteracy up until the 20th century, and that meant that ages were sometimes rounded to the nearest 5, and place names and people names were spelled phonetically. So this means you might have to do some creative thinking, especially to interpret some of the English place names that don't pronounce half the letters. Likewise with dates, you'll want to look at a date range rather than a specific year, don't trust that they were born in 1823. It might have been a couple of years on either side, and 1823 is the calculated year because they gave their age as 25, and that's just counted backwards. So always keep your parameters a little bit flexible. You may need to try searching for a few different options in the different places that have the information. You might have a diary, letters, photographs in your possession, which is great. So start with them and ask questions about them, like who was writing it, who was the intended audience, what was its purpose, how might that have affected what the author included or excluded, and what events does it describe? And all of these questions will help you start to think analytically about the information it contains and push you to verify it with other accounts or research into the events. Another favourite source is the newspaper. A lot of countries, archives, counties, states have digitisation projects for newspapers. So here on the screen, you can see Australian, French, Dutch, and New Zealand websites, which are all free and open access. Now, there are some that are behind the paywall, like the British newspapers online, but public libraries, or of course our course, give you access to some of those as well. Google Translate can be really useful if you're trying to understand a story in another language. It does depend on the language as to how accurate it is, but it can be helpful for getting the gist of the story. Again, remember that these newspapers were written for a purpose. Think about the different types of media we have today, and the left wing or the right wing, the different ways that they approach their stories. That is exactly the same as it used to be, that you had newspapers that approached stories from different angles. So it can be helpful to find a few accounts of a story if that's possible. But a newspaper is still a good substitute if you're missing records. There's more likely to be a date, a mistake in a birth date in, say, an obituary for a 90-year-old than in the birth record for that same person. But that will be better than nothing if you can't find any birth record for them at all. We also encourage you to go and look at journal articles and well-researched books. Round out your research, expand your focus from just your individual people, and try to think about the bigger picture and go and learn as much as you can about the society at the time. So once you've got all that information collected, what should you do with it? So we have a couple of units in the diploma that are taught out of the School of Creative Arts and Media, and they're all about this, finding creative ways to tell the stories. So you could write them down. We have some writing units, but a lot of people have blogs or self-publish their family stories. You could make some artwork out of them. So there are professional artists who are making spectacular pieces related to their own family history. But there's also about 1,000 ideas on Pinterest for what you can do with what you have found. Or my personal favorite, you can make a map of it. So tools like Google Maps are really good for basic visualizations and for keeping track of where your people were. And Google Maps is not too bad for being able to color code according to dates or generations or family lines. And you can sometimes put in photos or short blurbs to the different points, so you can tell a story through the map. Now, that map there was of my father's family in the Netherlands, and that brings us back to where we started, which was with my own family's story. So coming back to this little map here of Aalsmeer, and along the main street of Dorpstraat, there's even a little property shown right on the very approximate spot that my father grew up. It's really tempting to think of the family living on this site for 250 odd years, but that somehow seems unlikely. Nonetheless, just knowing that they were in this town for centuries is really interesting. For my dad, of course, this site is important, whether his family and the house had been there for 5 minutes or 500 years before he arrived. So this is the house he grew up in before he was born. Now, if the dates on this photo are correct, it was taken shortly after my grandfather and his business partner were refused permission to renovate the front of this building. Willem Wegman was an electrical engineer, and he was working in the most Dutch of pursuits. He worked on the electrical systems for flower hothouses. Now, during my father's childhood, he remembers that there were big workshops at the back, and there were hot lunches provided for the employees every day. So when I was in Amsterdam in 2019, Dad asked me to go and see if the house was still there. On his birthday, on a clear wintry day, I took a train and a bus out towards the airport and then found myself wandering along a suburban, nondescript road. I counted the numbers and then there was the house. So I paced back and forth, trying to get up the courage to ring the bell. I went and asked at the shop over the road if they knew who lived there. They had no idea. And so I did a few blockies, took a few photos, and then decided that I was too shy and needed some lunch. So I went to the library. Now, I have just recommended that you always start at the library. In this instance, that did not work. I went into the public library that was just around the corner from this house and asked them about it. And they gave me blank stares. They had no idea who lived there or whether the person was home or whether I would be able to knock on the door. And so I sort of gave up, but decided to stop for some lunch. So I went into the library cafe and got chatting to the server. And she sort of said, you know, what on earth is this Australian doing in this tiny nondescript Dutch town? I explained and she said, oh, I think that's Susan's house. Oh, she's friends with my mum. Hang on, I think she lives there still. I'll give her a call. So sure enough, she rang her up and 10 minutes later, I was in the attic of the house that my dad grew up, hearing all these stories about this house and having features pointed out that apparently my grandfather had over-engineered for example, a roof prop that was classic Wegman because it was so excessive to the task. Now, 2 months later, we were all heading towards lockdown and all travel had been cancelled indefinitely. While I never got to ask those questions of my granny about multiple engagement rings in her jewellery box, I'm so glad that I did get that chance to link all those maps, the records, the stories, the black and white photographs that I'd been asking Dad about for years. I got to connect them to a tangible brick and mortar experience in 3D full colour. Now, history has a tendency to hook people in for all kinds of reasons. It's become my profession because I'm addicted to the thrill of imagination as I think about the lives ordinary people lived and the potential of all those stories. Family history brings that thrill right home to our very doorsteps, and it connects the stories to the very people who surround us today. Thank you.
Thank you, Imogen. That was wonderful. Got my mind racing about my mum's actually doing some family history, and I should be sending her to look at the YouTube of this webinar afterwards. So look, just a little reminder to everyone on this call that you can ask questions through the Q&A function, and to remind you that if you do that, please bear in mind that your questions need to be focused on what might benefit the 188 people and all those listening afterwards, rather than very specific questions around individual bits of research that you're trying to complete. It'd be lovely to answer all of those individual questions, but we just can't. But I did wonder, a number of the questions that came in first, before the webinar, Imogen, and indeed, I guess, to a sort of more general point, someone was making a comment around the Time team, and I think about the popular television series, Who Do You Think You Are, and so forth. we don't all have an army of production assistants and researchers and so forth. But I think you've given a really helpful way of some general tips around the value of organisation, being rigorous in your own research and sort of true to yourself, and also in a way keeping things simple, one step at a time, one thing leading to another, and sort of diligently pursuing things. So thank you for that, and also for your the tools that you provide people to help manage complexity, growing levels of complexity. It's sort of like the oscillation of a wave, isn't it, where you start off with a little bit and before you know it, it's become this very big, loud sound wave. I wonder if we can go back to the beginning, and I'll start off with a question that you really set when you opened your webinar, which was really around the fallibility versus the reliability of some of those early internet tools that people start with, and how much value you place on that versus the business of actually just starting talking to your own family about A, B, C. I'd be interested in the explosion really of tools that are available versus the simplicity of talking to those closest to you.
I don't think that they are an either or option. So I was never going to do a DNA test because I wasn't too sure about sort of I had some ethical hesitancies around it, which there's lots of stuff online about. But then I was doing some work for a genealogical company and they gave me a free one. And so it took me a year to decide that I would. And of course, in that time, I had done other research into my family. And so I had a fairly good idea of a family tree already. And so it was an interesting exercise for me to then line up those two data sets that I had. So I had actually inherited some family trees from several different sides of the family. And then I had this one come in. And I found it a really interesting exercise to see where they did align. But I think that how useful doing, for example, a DNA test is going to be for you will really, really depend on what your heritage is. So they're massive in Britain, and I think the US have really big markets of lots, like very large databases, but then there's other countries where very few people do them, and so so those people aren't reflected in the results. So I think that they can be a good starting point if you sort of like the sciencey way of getting into it, but make sure you then pursue those results and question them and try to actually build out on the stories. Or they can be a good way to complement what you've already got and see if there's some missing links, perhaps some siblings of your immediate family who have fallen off the tree because they don't appear in the records that you've looked at. So it's, when you're talking about families that have, 10 children in the 1800s, then it's quite easy to kind of miss a child sometimes. And if they sort of don't have a huge paper footprint left behind them. So I think that they're not mutually exclusive, but we need to be careful about how we work, how we use some of those tools that are available.
Thank you. Imogen, I think, again, it was interesting and in a way heartening to be reminded of the value of libraries. It's, we're in a time where resources are tight, public funds are limited, and still there is a place where not everything can be done online. Actually going along to your local library is a really good thing to do. There's a couple of questions related to that, and I'll leave you to decide which order you take them in. One is there, particularly with the explosion in interest in family history, is there a tension between the time available for library staff to help with these things? So does this tap into actually an enjoyable and pleasurable thing that local libraries are kind of servicing their continued value, if you like, or actually creating an enormous strain on limited resources? The other question is a couple of people in the advanced submission questions really tip into, if I can generalize some of their very specific questions, are around how easy it is to work with libraries or other providers of information across borders. So if you're in Australia, but you actually need to do some research elsewhere, you can't travel there, what is your experience around the ease with which you can pursue your research across borders?
Yeah, those are great questions. So in terms of the library load, some libraries now have dedicated family history teams, or they'll have volunteers who have a roster to come in and help people with their family history. I think it's important to remember that libraries, they don't earn money, they earn footfall. And so for them, just having people in the library is worth a huge amount. And so you need to be realistic when you go in. You need to let your librarian, go when they need to actually go and help other people. Don't try to monopolize. But in my experience, generally library staff are pretty happy to give you a good bit of time in helping, especially if you've got a sticky question that you're trying to answer. And so often people, I think, turn up to libraries kind of sort of a bit ashamed, thinking, oh, I should be able to do this on my own, or whatever. But, it's people in the building, and that is what libraries really value, actually, just people using their resources. So I would encourage you all to, be realistic, be reasonable in what you are asking. We encourage students to learn how to do the research on their own. So we are very much about answering questions with questions. And giving you the resources to go and keep learning on your own. And that's how libraries also operate, that they'll point you towards the resources and say, this is how you use them, now you find the answer. And so let them do that and accept that offer to learn, really. It's an opportunity for you to learn how to use new tools, new programs, new resources in a very friendly environment. And when you're thinking about that larger picture of approaching libraries that you can't actually access, libraries have very friendly staff, but occasionally you'll get unfriendly people, as in all workplaces have the workplace grump. And so don't be put off if you do get a rude reply every now and then from places, because it just means you've got unlucky with who answered your email. For the most part, I think that they're usually pretty happy to help. Again, especially if it's those interesting, someone from Australia wants to find out something, then there's kind of a slight novelty to that. But there's also a lot of Facebook groups or message boards and various other online communities in different spaces. There's, genealogical Reddit, there's family history Twitter, all these different places where you can connect in and find people who are in that local area. So there's a large network of trade of can someone go into the Lincolnshire archives and take some photos of these documents for me, or can someone help me translate this Danish document? There's this informal community of help. So hook into that, usually just by Googling whatever nationality and family history group or something, and you'll find some groups that will hopefully have friendly people who are able to give you advice and possibly even visit some of those archives, or have already got a copy of that file, and they can give you help.
Thank you. And even as you were talking and thinking about the power of the global community of interested people, if ever there's a kind of a classic example of that in Tasmania, albeit with a more recent history, but wasn't it Saru Riley who simply used Google and some Facebook groups to start that process of connecting? Can someone tell me, is this the water tower, blah blah blah, so not related to his family in any way. So there's a really good example where the most profound things can come from asking that globally connected community to help in the ways that we weren't able to do only a few decades ago. So that's an interesting. Again, keep it simple. Ask a question. Someone might be able to help. You talked very much around thinking about different and creative ways of recording family history. So you talked about people do blogs, there's artwork, there's books. So, beyond actually just charting through that, through your family history, you can turn it into quite an interesting record for others. One of the questions that we had from Christina was actually taking it one step further and thinking, can you monetize your family history? And I suppose at a basic level, the answer is simply yes. There's been plenty of people. I guess for the everyday person, it really depends, presumably, on what the common interest in that history is. And so not everyone is going to be interested in your story, but I wondered if you have any examples or experience of people who might be, on the face of it, if you like, just if anyone is just a member of the public, have turned their family history into an income. And the question is prompted really by wanting to restore an historical property. So, the motives are good, if you like. I guess there'll be plenty of people who'd be thinking about how can they fund historical renovation projects.
I think that monetizing one personal life, like one story, is probably going to be a bit difficult. There are examples, there are plenty of memoirs that have been written of interesting individuals and that have been published by very reputable publishers. I'm sure that we've all read some really good books that kind of tell the story of an individual or a group or a family. And those are family history in a lot of ways, sort of social history, family history. It's a very blurry line between them. But I think that it would be difficult when it's just sort of, I don't want to say an everyday family, because every family is actually genuinely interesting. There's always something in there. But I think that is going to be more difficult when it isn't someone you can sell to a publisher as having done a remarkable thing or lived an interesting life or whatever. But you do sort of see examples of family history being used to accentuate the value of a property or a place. So the family history being when a property is turned into a public space of some sort, incorporating the family history into how the story of that place is being built, can really add to the value because it returns those people to it. So, you sort of have the example of the National Trust in the UK at the moment, and I think English Heritage as well, who are really campaigning to have more inclusivity in their stories. And so they're reintroducing the stories of the slaves who worked in places or who funded the construction of places. They're bringing in queer stories. They're telling all these slightly alternative stories that have kind of been pushed to the side that are very interesting, but are still stories of individuals. But by bringing them into that space, they are making it a much more personality-focused kind of a place that actually returns that life into it. So that if you're thinking about the connection between property and family history, that would be the obvious link for me. I know there's often family historians publish or self-publish their books about the people that they're researching, but self-publishing is not a money spinner. It's you do that out of love of the subject rather than to make your wealth.
Imogen, if I may, there's a couple of questions that come through on the Q&A function, and I think probably some of these are relatively quick and straightforward things. But if I may, I'll just ask a few specific questions, which I think might be of interest to a broader group of people. So it's come up a couple of times. Kylie asks, I often wonder about people who have two very separate birth dates, both of which can appear in the churches. And so you mentioned around having wide parameters, but as I said, it came up in the pre-submitted questions, that how do you work out which one is the real one if you've got that it seems like the same person but appears in documents more than once?
Sometimes you don't.
That's probably not what Kylie wants to hear.
Yeah, in all history, you have to choose your battles. You need to choose which are the puzzles that are crucial to solve. If it's a question of, are there two individuals and which one is mine, then you need to answer that. If it's a matter of they've got two birthdays that are both within the same month, but just with a day or two apart, and maybe in 2 different years, there's some resemblance between them, and everything else says that they're the same person, I would put that one to the side and leave it as a to come back to later on. So yeah, pick your battles, decide what is important, what is necessary to clarify, and what can you kind of hesitantly accept, with some reservations. Don't accept it without reservation. Do keep that sort of thought at the back of your head, keep it noted, so that if things start to get tangled down the track, you know that you need to come back to that.
We're definitely not in the world of exact science here.
No.
So Sharon asked the question around whether wills are a useful source of information.
Absolutely they are. They tell you who is in the family. They tell you a bit about the relationships between the people in the family. They tell you about wealth, about property, about everyday life. You can tell a lot about how a family lived, sort of their quality of life, from the contents that are bequeathed. Wills are fantastic.
Excellent. Somebody else asked whether members of the public are able to access historical census records, and where do you begin? Is that back to the library?
Yes, depends on where you're talking. So British censuses are on Ancestry. I think it's Ancestry. They're on one of those. And in Australia, often the library, it's all depends on where you are. They were done by the state, sort of state focused till the early 20th century. So yeah, go and talk to your librarian and ask them about the specific place that you are looking for.
All right. And there's another one, which I suspect is a very easy question to answer, but where in Tasmania, for example, is the best place to start exploring the landholder history? So the history of the land on which forebears once lived.
I would start with a map. So I would go to List Map, which is run by Dipipwi. It's their online mapping platform. It's, I think personally, the best mapping platform in Australia for all the state departments, but it has historical layers of land grants. If you know the area, then you can look, you can't search by name. You need to sort of actually just go and look at the area, but they also have all their historic properties, historic titles and deeds online. You just need to get a free login, but that's really straightforward.
Thank you. And Elizabeth asks, what approach do you suggest in searching for family members where children were farmed out in unofficial adoption, where records of birth exist but little else?
There's a website called Find and Connect, which is focused on orphanage and stolen children, all of broken families history. And so they've got huge number of resources. So Find and Connect, just Google it, and that will give you information about what was happening in your state or territory at the time that you're interested, and give you some background and hopefully some resources to help you.
And look, I think we do have a couple of questions remaining, but they're really very specific. And given that we're short of time, I think I'm going to draw the Q&A session to a close. But Imogen, you've been wonderful in sharing your tips and tricks of how to manage family history. Clearly a very interesting topic. So although we can't hear all of our audience, 160 plus interested alums, I'm sure they're all joining me and giving you a very warm and loud round of applause. And indeed, some of the people on the Q&A, actually it wasn't a question, but just say how much they've enjoyed and valued the session this afternoon. So it's really resonated very deeply, I think, with a number of people. And this is a really prime example of the expertise that we have here at the University of Tasmania and amongst our alumni community. So thank you, Imogen, for that. Just to remind everybody that the recording of this afternoon's presentation will be available soon via our YouTube channel, which you can access through the Explore website, and you should now be able to see that on your screen. So you've got, excuse me, all the details of that. Very soon you will receive an invitation to take part in another engaging webinar on Tuesday, the 21st of September. And that's going to be with an alumnus, Tristan Edwards, co-founder, president, and Chief Investments Officer of Life Biosciences. I have heard him speak before when I was visiting him in the States, and he's going to talk to us about ways in which he's going to be exploring targeting the biology of aging. It's very fascinating, and I do encourage you to book onto that on 21st of September. Aging is the biggest risk factor in almost every chronic disease. Tristan will offer insights into the groundbreaking research over the past decade that has shown that aging is a modifiable risk, a risk factor, and that can be targeted therapeutically. So if aging is of interest to you, then please do tune in for that. But perhaps there's a topic that we haven't covered, or that this has prompted you to think of something else you'd love to hear about. Please do contact the alumni team, share with us your thoughts about what you'd like to hear about in the future. We're always very interested in your views, what resonates, and what we can do about organising a talk in the future. But for now, that just leaves me to say thank you so much for joining us. Thank you again, Imogen. Do join us on a webinar soon. But for now, good afternoon.